Okay, we'll jump into it. Okay, agenda for today. Very excited about this. The last live bootcamp that we did, I think, was exactly a year ago. So a lot has changed, to say the least. I think when it comes to Notion Consulting, at least for me personally, and just having conversations with other Notion consultants. So the goal today is getting into the consultant canvas. And I'll preface it and probably reiterate several times today, but this document, we're referencing it. If it works effectively, we're referencing it in our own workspaces for virtually everything that we're doing, whether it's proposal writing or content creation or creating templates, because it's housing a lot of the key data on your core focus, who's your target audience, what are their pain points. So I think that's been a big unlock from last bootcamp to now, where prior to AI being able to read and interpret documents, a lot of times these kind of goal setting exercises were very much like standalone resources that we had to open up and revisit manually. Whereas I think now it plays a lot bigger role in our workspace if we're getting Notion AI to reference it whenever we can. We're going to get into some bootcamp logistics for everybody who's enrolled in the bootcamp. Just a few things in terms of goals for today and tomorrow, where to find our shared Slack channels, our shared Notion workspace. So I want to make sure that everybody's seeing the same stuff and can have the same levels of access. There's some forms and post-lesson survey components. I think I've met everybody in here, but I'm Dave. I'm a Notion Solutions partner. I've been doing this about 4 years now and have worked with over 50 clients in a pretty wide variety of industries. Started very broad and general. First leads that came in were very much 1 hour coaching sessions or support sessions. And that was just everybody from entrepreneurs to people in marketing. And I think lately, I'd say the past like 3 quarters or so have been when I've finally started to niche down. So the things I'm recommending, just take it with a grain of salt, where we don't have to figure out an exact niche today. It took me 3 years for context. So if you're starting to figure out a niche from now, you're probably far ahead of where I was when I started. I want to quickly get a sense of where we are in our consulting journey. If we can drop this into the chat, we'll take a minute or two, but very curious, are we just getting started? Have we had a couple clients, but still very much figuring out the details? Have we had several clients and focusing on scaling, or are we here to refine the things that we're already doing and maybe fill in some of the gaps that we might have with our consulting business? So let's take a minute to drop that into the chat. Okay, I'd say a big goal with the latest iteration of the bootcamp is to make sure that if we are starting out, we're building a foundation. If we feel like we're a seasoned consulting professional, hopefully we're filling in some gaps that are maybe things that we've figured out a while back that are collecting dust that we need to revisit. But the goal is to make sure that we're covering all of the key components. And I think especially for the client's journey, understanding where we may be getting tripped up or not accounting for in terms of building trust, generating leads that are warm, and ultimately, most importantly, turning those leads into deals if they're the right target client and audience. That's the goal, I think, this upcoming week, and we'll walk through some of the resources that are in the shared Notion dashboard that are all focused on the consultant canvas. So we'll get into those next. Okay, so I want to highlight some bootcamp logistics and also just because I know I see some people that were in previous bootcamps, I will follow up with you so you can, I've got some stuff for you to join on some of these things. But want to highlight a few key things. Module 0, these are really just deep dives on a variety of topics that are, in a nutshell, more anecdotal, like how I got into Notion Consulting. What did that look like? What are some of the things that have worked over the past few years the most, and some challenges to hopefully keep in mind and get ahead of. And ultimately, just get a kind of more of a background, and hopefully you get to learn a little bit more about me, and vice versa. I get to learn more about you. But if we get into module 1, we are here in framing our focus. So I'll make sure that the slides and this recording are here. But then these next 4 about the consultant canvas, vision, foundation. So if I were to open any one of these, we have a quick walkthrough video along with the slides that we're referencing, a quick summary of what we're talking about, and there's a reflection component. As we're going through each individual lesson, you'll have access to these reflections. So this is the first time we're doing it, so I want to make sure that this is working as expected because you are technically members of the workspace. But we're treating this as a journal where at the very end of the bootcamp, we can see a collection of our responses and hopefully get some more clarity on how we're approaching our consulting. And then if I go back to our homepage, if we click here, this is an invite link to, there's 3 Slack channels in total. There's a public forum for everybody who's part of the Luma calendar. And then there's a private bootcamp channel, which is brand new. And as we get into our next several weeks, each live session will get accompanied with those related lessons. So when we get into building our lead machine, which is a framework for building templates and resources for our target audience that helps us create content around that, that's going to be its own module, which is going to be module 2 that gets published below module 1. So I know this is gating some of the stuff, but I mostly want to emphasize the importance of getting through the consultant canvas and providing as much detail in there as possible before we get into thinking about what are the templates that we're making, what are some best practices on creating those resources, just so that we can focus in on these areas. Wanted to highlight those points with the dashboard. We covered this in the Notion Consulting Bootcamp landing page, but wanted to highlight these are essentially the 5 core modules that we're looking at. So we're focusing on framing. We're going to transition quickly into marketing. In a nutshell, how are we getting in front of the right target audience and clients? Transitioning that to sales, turning leads into projects and deals. What are some of the things that have worked for me personally in terms of everything from structuring the proposal in a certain way to automating follow-ups with people that have gotten proposals, really just getting a definitive yes or no as quickly as possible to, again, have that data. How are we doing on proposal win rates? Should we make adjustments when it comes to pricing or scope or delivery model? And the actual consulting component, that's a big one, but what has worked when it comes to client management and project management? I think the big takeaway over the past couple of years has just been getting better at proactive communication in terms of here's where we are in the project, here are some open items that we need you, the client, to follow up on in order to move forward. In addition to that, we're just doing a deep dive on how sprints have been helpful. And then lastly, how to leverage your existing network and current and previous clients for growth. Working in the VC space, this has been a lot more critical, where a lot of leads are relationship based, where it's a relatively small community. I'm following up directly, and I'd say the leads that come from referrals or from other relationships versus from content, it's shifted quite a bit, where before content would lead to people downloading templates and then reaching out and booking calls and sending proposals, whereas now it's gotten a lot more into following up with previous clients, keeping those relationships going, not just solely for referrals, but just to, build and maintain relationships in general, but has also had a big effect. So something I shied away from for a while, but has definitely paid off. In framing specifically, some of the things that we want to expand on are starting with our vision. Where are we positioned in the market? What does it look like to go to market? Figuring out our business model, including our project delivery. Are we starting out with hourly? Are we moving solely to long-term monthly retainers and everywhere in between? And how are we executing with clients? So today we're focusing on vision and a little bit of positioning, but for everybody in the bootcamp, we are definitely relying on the module 1, each individual lesson, to get a quick deep dive. In some cases, I'm referencing things that have worked in the past, things that haven't worked, just to give a little bit more context to the consultant canvas. Okay, just a quick aside on what I imagine Notion Consulting being like when I first started. Very much getting to build custom workspaces, walking clients through how these workspaces worked, and cheers, we did a great job. Everybody's super happy and having a great time in their new Notion workspace. This is not how these projects tended to go or even really go now either. In reality, working with clients when it comes to Notion or optimizing workflows, there's a lot of voices in the room. Everybody has usually very strong opinions. No one knows exactly where to go next. And as a Notion consultant, more often than not, you end up being the kind of de facto therapist for teams, where they use the meeting time to throw at you everything that's been problematic or challenging for their team, whether or not that's workflow related. So in a way, coming from outside of an organization with the task of helping teams work smarter, it usually bubbles up a lot of other challenges that a team or your client is facing that we have to mirror back in a way that is productive and could provide some direction. This goes back to a growing focus, or less of a focus on building and more of a focus on implementation, mostly because with how fast new AI models get released, Notion has been on a tear the last several months with new features. And I think teams have been pretty overwhelmed in addition to managing their day-to-day work. So the idea of having somebody come in that could make a definitive direction for what changes to make and how that's going to impact the team, and having clear milestones is by far the biggest benefit for the clients. It's something that nobody really has the bandwidth to do internally, and they could just get unstuck and get up and running and work in a better way using the latest and greatest tools and technology available. And then just want to highlight, this is becoming more and more true every day, I think, where we're moving away from solely being builders, even though I do build often and have to build and rebuild spaces in clients' workspaces. That's always part of it, but they're not a one-to-one relationship. I think when it comes to Notion consulting, I always tell clients the building is like 10% of the work and the other 90% is more change management. How do we make sure that everybody on a team can adopt these new spaces and processes? If they have questions, they know where to go and hopefully answer their own questions. And also clients feel confident building on top of what we've gotten up and running. In contrast to other Notion consultants or agencies, which are really built on a business model of long-term retainer engagements, my goal is always, how do we get you up and running to the point that you don't need me, a consultant, to manage your workspace? I just think they'll move faster, they'll be more confident, they could just get to the point where they could build their own solutions. And how do we figure out how to get there as quickly as possible? Nothing against the long-term retainer agencies out there. Most of them are friends of mine, so it's just a different approach. And then when it comes to teaching this course, for context, obviously apart from revenue, a bigger goal is the more consultants we have that are defined a niche, creating resources that are specifically solving those pain points that audience has, the more awareness there is about Notion consulting. I think a lot of the rationale for us creating content is just raising awareness that this exists as an option for teams to know where to go to find a consultant if we're through the certification, finding on the marketplace. But otherwise, there's a lot more practicing Notion consultants that are not in the directory or marketplace yet and are still doing great work. In general, the more of us we have that are solving specific problems, I think the better for the community as a whole. And I think, at least personally, having to put together this course also highlights the areas that I haven't really revisited often. So it's just a good forcing function to think through, where might I need to pivot in addition to all of us here. Okay, so the consulting canvas, in a nutshell, this is like if the lean canvas and the EOS, the entrepreneur operating system, had a baby and the baby was a Notion page. I think the benefits of the lean canvas was it made the business model canvas a lot more simplified and easier to work through, especially as a solo consultant. But the EOS and specifically the book Traction, mostly for larger organizations, but a lot of good takeaways for independent consultants. And so it's taking bits and pieces from both and all of which are applicable to stuff we're covering in later modules. I'll reiterate, if there's one thing that we have to get done 100%, it's this consultant canvas, because if we get into ideating on templates or content and we don't have a lot of clarity on some of the things that we cover in the canvas, it's either going to be too general or too broad or just not resonate with that target audience. There's a plethora of general Notion or productivity content out there. I think if the goal is to generate warm leads and eventually clients, it does need to be more focused. What that means is probably a smaller audience, but a more engaged audience. When we get into the consulting canvas, a couple things I want to highlight. This is mine because I'm also filling this out, but pretty straightforward. We have the left column, which is just giving more context, some examples, some follow-up additional information to keep in mind. And the right side, this is where we're plugging in our responses. If I scroll to the very bottom, there's a prompt here so that as we are getting closer to completing the canvas, we're basically copying and pasting this prompt into Notion AI, or if we're using ChatGPT or Claude, along with exporting this consultant canvas if we're not doing it in Notion, so that we end up with a cleaned up version of the canvas with only our responses. So this is something that if we have detail in it, we're referencing it when we're creating templates and creating content. So want to highlight that in that toggle at the very bottom. Probably the first two are what we're focusing on here, but when it comes to values and focus, a couple things I wanted to highlight. And I think based on our original poll, I think the majority of us are later in our consulting journey. Few of us are starting from zero. So we've probably already thought about this in some form or have already filled out an existing similar exercise. But the two key things I want to focus on with vision are specifically the principles that we want to have in place anytime we're working with a client. What are the things that you want to highlight about how you're working with clients, your methodology, how you're delivering service, and things that are unique to you or to your team, and also the standards that are non-negotiables for you, the things that you feel like you will not budge on when it comes to principles or standards. This, I think when we're early on, when I'm thinking about the first year and a half of consulting, I was a lot more malleable on this stuff. And usually when I had a negative client experience, a lot of it came back to not sticking to the principles that I had set up, or even not having had much thought about it. And so it just wasn't a good fit. And I didn't really have the capacity to see that in advance until the projects crashed and burned, which has happened. Thankfully, not lately, but definitely had some dumpster fires early on in the process. So what I want to do is take about 5 minutes, and when we're in the consultant canvas, focusing in on that core value section. If you do jump ahead, that's totally fine when it comes to the core focus. Personally, some things that come to mind, and I cover this in the deep dive lesson, focusing on education, making sure that clients are empowered to build on top of their own workflows and adapt with new tools and technologies as they come out, being proactive about where we are in a project, where we need some decisions to be made, and just making sure that I'm as little as possible working in a silo and sharing what's happening, even if it's in progress, what's highest priority. Most of the time, clients are okay with the process, but I think it just adds a little bit of peace of mind where it never seems like I've gone off and disappeared for a few days or a few weeks. Those are some of the things that are, I think, top of mind for me. This is something that I struggle with a lot when it comes to big long-term goal setting or vision planning. It always feels very abstract and very loosey-goosey. What does this mean for like my work today? But I think having just tried to practice more with revisiting vision statements or kind of annual goals, if we're using our vision effectively, this is translating into the day-to-day decision making that we're making around conversations that we're having with prospective clients, resources that we're creating. Because, for example, if one of our values is getting clients using cutting edge technology, that's going to influence what we're talking about and how we're talking about it, and attract that specific type of client who's interested in that but doesn't quite know how to do it. It could feel like this is very detached, but once we get into our exercises on building a content calendar and ideating on templates, we're pulling in all of the details from here. One quick aside, because I think it was a light bulb moment for me, I was talking to a founder the week of Make with Notion, and they were really excited about AI tools and were very early stage. And he basically said, we don't really have a marketing team because we're just using AI agents that essentially replace what a marketing team would do or what a CMO would do. And my main pushback on that was, when we're creating agents to completely replace human roles, there's nothing stopping every other competitor from doing the exact same thing. So how are we differentiating how we're using technology or using AI that gives us an advantage over every other competitor who could just find and use the same prompts or the same agents or agent templates to do the same thing? And I think that's where the human expertise and what your previous expertise, where the value is, because you probably have had scenarios where you've implemented things and failed or succeeded, and you've had those takeaways. And we're likely getting to a point where all of us are going to be working with agents and having teams that are maybe 50% agents, but we're still bringing in that expertise on deciding when and where to use them and how that fits into our workflows. So want to highlight that when it comes to tying it back to vision. Again, the more detailed we could get here, the better. Want to transition back to the core focus, because I think we'll tackle this one and then open it up for some Q&A and then talk about what we're covering next week. But in the core focus area, this is more about the impact that we want to have with clients. So when we think about clients that we worked with previously, the ones that have gone well, the ones that we've been most excited about, we want to dive a little bit deeper into what excites us about working with that client or in that project type, to really get that on paper, so that when we talk about our target audience, we just want to make sure that there's enough overlap there and there's a positive overlap. But at this stage, curious how we would define our niche and details on, is it by industry? Is it by team size? By location? What are the characteristics of that organization or client within that niche that we want to focus in on? But we'll take a couple minutes for this one. I'm going to put a timer that's not on the slide because this timer actually doesn't work. And we'll take a couple minutes to do that and then talk about some where this is going to fit into later parts of the canvas. All right. Continuing off of core focus, I think a big piece that's directly tied to this is our non-negotiables. And again, I'm focusing in on this one because I think in retrospect, a lot of the projects that were essentially failures, more specifically, we get a workspace up and running and then they were technically done, but there's still a lot of confusion or open questions. And a few weeks or months later, we end up with an abandoned workspace, that type of thing. I'd say that happened maybe 3 or 4 times. And then I think some of the other ones that come to mind are where there's a lot of momentum initially, where we want to do everything in Notion, and that quickly leads to a team getting just really overwhelmed. Like from one day to the next, we have an entirely new set of team spaces and nobody really has had the chance to adapt. So too many changes too quickly. A lot of times we're driven by the client, in a lot of cases with positive intentions of just excitement around getting up and running and being excited about Notion. But when it comes to non-negotiables, making sure that we kind of stick to our internal rules when it comes to how we want to operate. And I think just leveraging that expertise, knowing that if we do take on too much too quickly, it's going to be overwhelming. Or if we get a workspace launched but haven't had a chance to field questions or to train team members, that could lead to a lot of confusion or miscommunication. So in addition to that, at some point, making sure that we have time to elaborate on the non-negotiables as well. And then This is also something that I probably did quite a bit, where you have creators that you follow, that you read their stuff and they're doing similar work. It's very easy to just copy and paste someone else's vision or values. But important thing to keep in mind, creators with larger followings are maybe a couple years or several years ahead, and they've also had their own unique journey with their own takeaways and successes and failures. So the goal here is taking your experience and translating that into values that work for you. It's always useful to see if others are sharing content about their own, but ultimately these are yours. When we talk about our niche, and if I jump back to the consulting canvas, so we have our core focus area. So this is where we're at least doing a 1.0 of what that niche looks like before we get into our 10-year vision. If we jump to some things to avoid, we want to avoid being too broad. There's a lot of broad general productivity content out there. There's a lot of templates out there. Unless we're creating a project management template to showcase something new, or you just do it as a hobby, that's totally fine. But in terms of generating leads, we have a pretty good supply of templates, of general templates out there. However, when we get into specific industries, that's where I feel like there's still a huge gap in terms of resources, walkthroughs. I talk with VC clients, and this comes up a lot, that they're looking at Notion's Academy website, and it's rarely highlighting their specific pain points. And there's just a gap of resources and knowledge out there just in that one specific example, but I think this applies in a lot of different industries. And this is a working document. So once we copy and paste this into a cleaned up Canvas document that Notion AI is referencing, you always have the flexibility of adding in additional notes or context or making edits. So this is very much a V1. I'm also just rewinding to when I was just starting out and was teaching, working with high school students at the time. And basically it was January, and I gave myself 5 months to see, was there enough leads to jump into this full time? I think this was in 2021. But the money motivator was real in terms of taking on whatever project was out there to get revenue. And that's a completely valid and expected challenge, especially if we're jumping into this full time and we've left a previous role or quit our job and need to pay the bills. But we can do that while also having a plan for transitioning to having more control and more leverage over the types of projects that we're taking on. And the goal is to get to that point as quickly as possible while keeping some financial stability. Thankfully, when I started, by the time the summer rolled around, I think I had 4 active clients and was enough to jump into it full time. And then one last note, because this is probably one of the biggest mistakes I made when I was first starting out. Again, I was teaching at the time, but I had studied and worked in architecture previously. I had tried and failed several times to get Notion implemented in education, created content around it. But every one of us is coming into this with our own expertise, our own experience, working at an organization or freelancing or maybe working in different industries. So we all have built up at least some network, and at the very minimum, being able to reach out to friends and colleagues and say, hey, I'm working on this new service. I'd love to get your take on it. Getting any and all feedback that we can. Maybe some of those turn into projects, but they don't need to. The goal here is to just aggregate as much data as possible. And the more we're talking about our services, the more we're fostering serendipity, where somebody you just talked to has a conversation a couple days later with somebody who's using Notion, and they get you in touch. This is something that's been happening a lot more in the VC space that has nothing to do with content or templates that I'm making, and all to do with just setting aside as much time as possible for conversations. So wherever your network is, that's a great starting point to just bounce ideas off of. As we get into creating templates and creating our content plan, just leveraging our networks for that feedback. For everybody who's enrolled in the bootcamp, some things to keep in mind over the next couple days. So if I collapse this module 00, we have all the pieces of the consulting canvas through the business model. And then these last 3 were basically excerpts from previous bootcamp that just extracted some of the key takeaways that we talked about in terms of defining a niche, a little bit of a deep dive on the value proposition, like how is what we're proposing different and unique for our audience from our competitors. And then also a deep dive on business models, which we cover both, but this is really just identifying the pros and cons of looking at things like billing hourly versus by project versus productized service versus retainer. And then likely by early next week, we're going to launch the marketing module, which is leading up to Thursday's live session on building a lead machine, which is solely just using Notion AI to take our ideas and whatever content we've created in advance so that we can hopefully train Notion AI on our own voice and language to start talking about these pain points that our target audience is having. That's just a quick heads up on what the next couple days looks like. Last thing I want to cover, if you're in the again, there's some archive content on the right side. So these are like resources from previous cohorts. I just forgot to mention that. Otherwise, I'm going to be following up, making sure that if you're not in bootcamp, you get access to the general forum. And if you are in bootcamp, you have access to the Notion workspace and our modules and lessons, along with the private chat in Slack. Again, from there, if especially for everybody enrolled, any questions that come up at any point, drop them in there. Happy to follow up, and the more the merrier. But on that note, I will see you all next week and see you all on the interwebs. Have a great rest of the week.